Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I'm happy to join my colleague from New Hampshire and other colleagues tonight to talk about one of the most serious threats to ever face this nation or, in fact, this world. A few years ago, Tom Brokaw, the television news anchor, wrote a wonderful book called The Greatest Generation. And he was writing about the generation of our parents and grandparents that fought World War II, paid off the debt from World War II, built the interstate highway system, paid for it, by the way, and built one of the greatest economies, the greatest economy the world has ever seen, the greatest generation. The characteristic of that generation was meeting their responsibilities, was not avoiding problems, but meeting them head on, and establishing for the world and for this country an example of governance and of responsible dealing with issues and problems, the likes of which we have not seen in our lifetimes. Now, if Tom Brokaw was writing another book today about us, it would be called The Lousiest Generation. We're the ones who have built up an unconscionable debt for our children. We've cut taxes in the middle of a war in 2005, the first time that I've been able to find in world history that that's ever happened. We've given ourselves tax cuts, not paid the bill, and are passing on this enormous $22 trillion debt to our children. None of us on our deathbed, when our children were standing around, would lean up and say, "Here's the credit card, kids. I've run it up to the max. You can now pay for it." And yet that's exactly what we're doing collectively. The lousiest generation, the one that hasn't paid its bills. Infrastructure. We've allowed our infrastructure to fall to pieces. The infrastructure that was given to us by our parents, that was paid for. The bridges, the roads, the railroads, the airports. And now we have one of the poorest infrastructure situations in the world. It's embarrassing to go to a small country somewhere else in the world and walk into an airport that makes ours look old and falling apart. So we haven't kept up with the infrastructure, and that's a debt that we're passing on to our children, just as real as the national debt. And finally, Mr. President, we are facing a known, real, unquestionable crisis in terms of the effect on the climate. And this is something that we are shamefully passing on to our children. They are the ones that are going to have to deal with the consequences that we won't face. They're the ones that are going to have to pay the bills, that are going to have to shore up the infrastructure, that are going to have to respond to the drastic changes in the climate, not only here, but around the world, and we're doing nothing. What will it take, Mr. President, what will it take for us to meet this responsibility? What's it going to take? Well, okay, let's go down a list. Maybe it will take scientific data that demonstrates the level of CO2 that we have put into the atmosphere. Well, I don't seem to have that chart. Okay, we'll get back to that one later. So I don't need a chart. For millions of years, CO2 has varied between 180 and 280 parts per million. People say, well, it varies over time. This is nothing new. No. Between 180 and 280, that's the variation. Until the last 50 to 75 years, when it's become a hockey stick, we are now at over 400 parts per million, the highest it's been in 3 million years. And by the way, the last time it was at 400 parts per million, the oceans were 60 feet higher. CO2 in the atmosphere is our responsibility. It didn't come from volcanoes. It came from the consumption of fossil fuel, which developed and built the wonderful economy that we have and the economy around the world. Nobody can gainsay that. The question is, now we're seeing the consequences. Don't we have a responsibility to do something about it? Has there been a gigantic increase in CO2 in the atmosphere? Check. Yes, unquestionably. Number two, how about Arctic ice? Here we are. In the last 30 years, 2/3 of the Arctic ice has disappeared. 2/3. I was at a conference this morning on the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean is open for the first time in human history. The conference is about shipping and mineral exploration and native peoples losing their habitat and their way of life. 2/3 of the Arctic ice gone in 25 years. This is a place that's been covered with ice for thousands of years, as long as we have any memory. But now the Arctic ice is going. And every time I see a prediction of where it's going to be in 10 years, lo and behold, it's there in 2 or 3 years. It's opening up. That's telling us something. Is there an indication from the Arctic ice that something drastic is happening to our climate? Yes. Check that box. Number three, increased intensity of fires. We've seen the most intense wildfires in this country in the last 10 years that we've ever seen. More acreage, more intensity, more lives lost, more property loss. This is caused by drought, by changes in the climate, all wrought by our activity. Increase in fires and wildfires, check. Sea level rise. Here's the background on the sea level. We tend to think of the sea level as being a fixed quantity. We walk out in the ocean, always it looks pretty much the way it is, whether it's off the Maine coast or the New Hampshire coast. Well, it turns out that back here 24,000 years ago, when the glaciers were covering most of North America, the sea was 390 feet shallower than it is today. Chesapeake Bay was dry land, 390 feet shallower than it is today. Then the glaciers melted, and the sea level started to rise. And this is an interesting period here, about 14,000 years ago, called the Meltwater Pulse 1A. This drastic rise in sea level is about a foot a decade. That's what's predicted for the next century. Oh, it could never happen. A foot a decade, you must be crazy. It happened. We know that it happened. Now, here's why we aren't paying attention. The last 6,000 years, it's been pretty flat. It's been pretty level. The sea level has plateaued, in effect, and therefore, that happens to be recorded human history, that 6,000 years. So we think this is where the ocean has always been. But you know what? The last remnant of the glaciers are in Greenland and Antarctica, and they're going. They're going. There's 20 feet of sea level rise in the Greenland ice sheet and 212 feet of sea level rise stored in the Antarctic ice sheet, and they're going. I've been to Greenland. You can see it. The Jakob Havens Glacier has retreated as much in the last 10 years as it retreated in the prior 100 years. The only thing slower than a glacier, by the way, Mr. President, is the United States Congress. We make glaciers look like they're moving fast, and in fact, the Jakobshavn Glacier is moving fast. Sea level rise is happening. In Norfolk, Virginia, they've seen a 1.5 feet in the last decade. They're having sunny day floods. They're having sunny day floods in Miami. They're spending millions of dollars to build up their roads. And people say, dealing with climate change is too expensive. Not dealing with it is too expensive. Not dealing with it, the expense is going to be astronomical. And by the way, you talk about sea level in Norfolk, Virginia, it's a national security risk. The number of bases that we have around the world that are at or near sea level is going to be an enormous task and a very expensive one to protect those assets. There's another national security issue involved in this that we are ignoring, and that is the displacement of peoples. During the Syrian civil war, there were 4 to 6 million Syrian refugees that came. A few came here, not many. Most went to Western Europe, and as we know, that refugee flow turned the politics of Western Europe upside down. Call it 5 million people. The estimates for refugees from climate change over the next 100 years is between 200 and 400 million people. Imagine what that's going to do to the geopolitics of this world. 200 million people on the march, looking for water, looking for a place that's habitable, looking for relief from drought, from fires. This is a national security threat. Is it a national security threat? Yes, check that box. What's it going to take? What's it going to take? Intense storms. We don't need to tell people about intensity of storms. We've seen them. We've lived through. I once made a joke in Maine that I'm 300 years old, and somebody said, why? I said, because according to the news, I've lived through 3 storms of the century. We keep having storms of the century or 500-year storms, and they're happening more and more frequently. The heat. 9 out of 10 of the hottest years on record occurred in the last 15 years. This past June was the hottest June since records were kept. The hottest June since records were kept. Now, there's a difference between weather and climate. I understand that, and I'm not going to say that the heat wave that the Midwest is suffering this weekend is a reflection of climate change. It may or may not be. Weather is what happens day to day. Climate is what happens in the long term. And we know that we've already increased global climate by about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in many cases, it's causing irreversible damage. When we get to 2 degrees Celsius, which we're headed for, it's going to be catastrophic for coral, for farms, for animals, and for people. Species are already on the move. Senator Shaheen mentioned the ocean. The lobsters in Maine, there used to be a vigorous lobster fishery in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It's essentially gone now. And the lobsters in Maine, which is a mainstay of our economy, $1.5 billion year business, the lobsters are moving north and east. Why? Because the Gulf of Maine is heating faster than 99% of the areas of the world. The only place heating faster than the Gulf of Maine is the Arctic. And those lobsters are doing what any animal does. They seek out more hospitable climate. This isn't academic. This isn't predictions. This is something you can see. The people on the water in Maine know that it's happening. The woodsmen know that it's happening because they're seeing different species of trees. Bugs are moving further north. Ticks are a huge problem in northern New England in places where they weren't before. This isn't something that's academic. What's it going to take, Mr. President? And one of the things that the senator from New Hampshire talked about is, and I think it's important to emphasize because I hear this sometimes, why should we do this? It's happening everywhere in the world. Yes, that's why the Paris Climate Change Accord was so important. It wasn't mandatory, but it was a set of goals, and the entire world was engaged. Now there's the entire world but one, us. We're out. We're outliers. We've lost our voice. We've lost our influence. We've lost our leadership position on one of the most important challenges faced by this or any generation. Yes, we haven't met our responsibilities as our parents and our grandparents did. On December 1st, 1862, Abraham Lincoln came to the House chamber and spoke about the crisis of the Civil War. The Congress didn't get it. They were doing politics as usual, and President Lincoln was trying to move them from the lethargy of the legislative process into the emergency and the urgency of the Civil War. And he said 2 things toward the end of that speech that I think that are profoundly instructive for us today. The first is how to deal with this change. And this is a change. This is new. I understand that, and dealing with change is difficult. Abraham Lincoln uttered what I think is the most profound words about change that I've ever encountered. Here's what Abraham Lincoln said. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and therefore we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. And here's the punchline. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. We must disenthrall ourselves. That means think in new and different ways, see reality as it is, and then we shall save our country, and in this case, the world. The other admonition from Lincoln that day, I think, is very important for us, and it puts the responsibility directly on us right here. He said, fellow citizens, he was talking to members of Congress, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or the other of us. The fiery trial through which we pass, and of course he was talking about the Civil War, and we're talking about a fiery trial of our generation. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Mr. President, I want to meet this responsibility. I want this Congress to be remembered, as we will be either way, but I want this Congress to be remembered as people that met the fiery trial, that met our responsibility, thought about others than ourselves, and made a difference in the life of this country and the world. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.